The field cracked beneath the late Sahel sun. Thin lines of dust curled upward, drifting as if trying to escape the heat. No footsteps, no voices, only the land breathing. Then a faint hum, barely more than a whisper, slid across the air. It wavered above the silence, circling as though searching for something it had forgotten. A small shadow glided over the broken earth, sharp and quick, cutting the ground like a passing blade. Heads lifted, eyes narrowed. But no one could see the source, only the shadow, and the sound that followed it. In places like this, danger does not arrive on wheels or hooves. It hangs above you, weightless, patient, watching. The sky used to be empty. Now it remembers too much. Stay with this sky. Tonight it tells a different story. Morning often arrives without color in the Sahel. A pale light spreads across the ground, but the land does not soften. It waits, still patient, listening for what might move above it. For years, people walked these roads with only the wind for company. A traveler could judge distance by the sound of sand against his sandals or the low murmur of a kettle somewhere beyond the next ridge. The sky was a companion then, vast, indifferent, harmless. But slowly, one hum replaced another. It began with shapes no bigger than a bird, drifting over fields without warning. No dust followed them, no heat rose from their wings. They glided with a kind of a deliberate calm, as if the air itself had chosen to watch the earth more closely. In many villages, the first reaction was simple curiosity. Children pointed. Elders shaded their eyes. Some thought these floating things were part of a distant world, a world that rarely concerned itself with the dry roads between scattered huts. But curiosity does not last long in a place shaped by caution. It did not take many sightings before the feeling changed. What had looked like a toy from far away began to feel like an eye. Not an eye you could see, not one that blinked or shone, but an eye that hovered just long enough to make every step feel heavier than the last. People started to pause before crossing open ground. A woman carrying water would stop in the middle of the path, tilting her head slightly, listening for the thin, uneasy vibration in the air. A shepherd guiding his goats would choose a longer route, hugging the tree line, because the sky above the open plain no longer felt like a friend. Even the soldiers who patrolled these scattered regions found themselves adjusting their rhythm. A column would break formation, slipping into the narrow shade cast by thorn trees. Voices dropped to whispers. Motors were cut, not out of fear, but out of a growing awareness that silence was no longer theirs alone. The land's old logic had shifted. Paths once considered safe became uncertain, not because the ground changed, but because something above it had begun to reshape every decision below. Where to stand, where to rest, when to move, when to stop. In the Sahel, danger used to come from the horizon, from the line where land met sky. Now it came from the sky itself, and the sky had learned new tricks. Some of these drifting machines hovered in place, as if tasting the air for clues. Others moved in slow arcs, circling a single point again and again until every person beneath them felt the same tightness in their chest. Their size did not matter. A small shadow can unsettle a large heart. There were days when 2 or 3 shapes moved overhead, their sound weaving together like thin threads, barely audible but impossible to ignore. On such days, the village felt suspended, caught between earth and sky, unable to decide which direction offered certainty. And yet, somehow, life continued. Women still knelt by the riverbank, scrubbing clothes against smooth stones. Children still chased one another between huts, their laughter rising even when their eyes flicked upward. Men still repaired fences, herded cattle, and tended the cracked soil that refused to give up its struggle. But underneath all of it, a quiet truth settled like dust on a window ledge. The sky was no longer blind. It watched with a patience that made even the boldest footsteps careful. It carried sounds that belonged to no season and no storm. It marked the land with moving shadows, shadows that told people they were not alone, even when no other human figure stood nearby. To many, this new sky felt like a visitor who never left, a silent guest sitting at the edge of every conversation, a guest who did not speak, but who made everyone lower their voice just a little. Some nights, villagers gathered around small fires, talking in low tones about the shapes they had seen earlier in the day. They spoke of the way these machines drifted, the way they hovered, the way they seemed to know where to look. Stories grew from these moments. Not stories of battles or borders, but of watching, waiting, and the strange feeling of being observed by something you could not touch. And so the Sahel adapted, not through speeches or commands, but through countless small adjustments in the way people lived. A step taken closer to the shadow, a journey delayed until dusk, a basket held nearer to the chest while crossing an open square. Little things, each one reshaping the rhythm of a land long accustomed to its own silence. Even the desert noticed. When a single shadow passed slowly over the dunes, the grains of sand lifted as if stirred by a thought. The old wind paused, as if it too recognized that a new kind of presence had taken its place among the ancient elements. And the question pressed quietly against the ground. If a small machine can change how a whole region breathes, what might happen the next time it rises into the light? The road north was thin as a scar, a long ribbon of dust, cutting quietly through a land that rarely forgot footsteps. By late afternoon, the light had turned a muted gold, the kind that slips across metal and skin without warmth. A small convoy moved along that road. 2 trucks, a motorcycle, and a lone figure walking beside them, pressing his hand to the side of one vehicle as if feeling it breathe. Nothing unusual, nothing loud, just movement, steady, cautious, unremarkable, but high above the air vibrated. The first sound was soft, almost lost in the wind brushing through the dry grass. A faint hum, barely enough to disturb a passing bird, yet it held a certain purpose. The kind of tone that does not wander, but chooses. A shape drifted over the convoy, small, steady, a single blinking light beneath its frame. It moved with a slow confidence, as though it had been waiting for this moment. One of the men below lifted his head. He said nothing. He simply narrowed his eyes and shifted a step closer to the shade cast by the truck. The machine above leaned slightly, its arc widening, tracing the convoy with the patience of a shadow learning its subject. It did not descend. It did not rise. It simply circled, a quiet loop, again and again, as if drawing a symbol in the air no one could read. Then a second hum. Lower, calmer, far more distant. This one did not announce itself with a blink of light. It blended with the sky, a pale shape gliding so high that even the birds ignored it. It drifted not above the convoy, but above the land itself, covering miles with slow, deliberate passes. No one on the ground saw it, but its presence reshaped everything beneath. Inside a tent miles away, a screen flickered. Lines of a gray and brown blurred into familiar patterns. Paths, trees, dried creek beds. Then the convoy appeared on the display, small shapes against the dust, moving like quiet insects across a vast floor. A hand adjusted the controls. Another shape on the screen, the low drone, followed the convoy from behind. The high one, the ghost above, watched the entire region, unbothered by distance. Where one traced movement, the other traced intent. Back on the road, the man felt it, not the machine itself, but the weight that descends when the sky pays too much attention. Conversations shortened, breath slowed. The driver tapped twice on the side of the truck, a silent signal. The group shifted their formation, drawing closer to the tree line as the path bent east. The motorcycle rider killed his engine, letting the tires roll silently over loose soil. He raised a hand, pointing to a patch of thin forest ahead. Not thick enough for cover, but enough to soften the sky's gaze. The drone above dipped 1 degree lower. Its camera followed the convoy's change, its movements tightening like a coil. Far overhead, the high drone responded. A slow turn, a long glide, its lens adjusting to absorb the shifting pattern below. 2 watches, 2 distances, 1 stretch of land between them, and the convoy in the middle breathing carefully. The men moved into the trees, Branches scraped against metal. A loose top flapped once before being tied down. Every sound, no matter how small, felt amplified, as if the sky could hear the heartbeat of a single stone. For a moment, everything stilled. The dust settled into quiet spirals. The wind drew a single breath. Then a voice, low, steady, escaped from the man walking beside the truck. "We are not alone," he murmured, not to warn, not to alarm, but simply to acknowledge what everyone already felt. The drone above tightened its circle. It dipped lower, casting a sharper shadow that slipped over a fallen branch, a tire track, a boot print. Then the shadow vanished as it rose again, as if reconsidering its approach. Up high, the second drone adjusted too, but its movement was slower, measured, as if uninterested in the convoy and far more invested in the land surrounding it. The convoy waited. Men stood still, their hands on warm metal, listening for cues the earth could no longer provide. In some conflicts, the danger hides behind rocks or trees. Here, it hides in the air, in the narrow space between hearing and understanding. A leaf twitched, a bird startled. The hum grew softer, then louder again, then steadier, as though settling into a decision. Above them, the two machines moved in opposite arcs, one tight, one wide, their paths crossing for a breath-long moment. It was impossible to know whether they cooperated, competed, or merely observed. But the land reacted anyway. The trees held their breath. Even the dust stayed low, as if careful not to draw attention. One man looked up, his face half lit by the fading sun. "It feels," he whispered, "like the sky can see through us." No one disagreed. The convoy slowly began to move again, its wheels pushing gently through the undergrowth, choosing silence over speed, shadows over open ground. The drones drifted apart, the low one veering west, the high one continuing its long, unreadable sweep. The men did not relax, not yet. In the Sahel, a watcher leaving does not mean it has lost interest, only that it has looked long enough, for now. And so the question settled like dusk across their path. If two unseen hands can shape a single journey, how many more wait above tomorrow's road? In the small villages scattered across the Sahel, the days begin the same way, with the soft scrape of broom against sand, the clatter of metal basins, the cough of a tethered goat greeting the sun. Life moves quietly here. It always has. But now something else moves with it. A faint trembling in the air, a distant hum that slips between branches, too faint to command attention, yet too persistent to ignore. At first, only the children reacted. They would stop mid-run, a ball rolling from their hands, eyes narrowing toward the bright sky. Sometimes they pointed, sometimes they merely listened, their heads tilted like birds sensing a distant storm. Then the adults began to notice it too. A woman walking to the well would pause mid-step, her shadow stretching long across the ground. The jug in her hands would sway gently as she leaned into the silence, trying to decide whether the hum was real or a memory left from the day before. Men repairing fences would look up with a mixture of irritation and unease, their tools held motionless against sun-beaten wood. Old men sitting outside their mud homes would stop mid-sentence, their stories suspended in the air as if the sky itself had asked for quiet. The ceiling above the village, once ignored, once taken for granted, had become a presence, a watcher, a restless, shifting layer between earth and whatever mysteries lie beyond it. The villagers learned to read it the way they read weather. If the hum was high and faint, they continued their work. If the hum dipped lower, they moved beneath trees, drawing shawls and turbans closer, as though fabric could shield them from being noticed. But the hum did not always come. Sometimes it came twice, sometimes not at all. And that uncertainty, that inability to predict when the quiet above would break, changed the rhythm of everything below. Paths once taken freely became crossed with hesitation. A trip to a neighboring village grew longer, slower, more deliberate. People avoided open ground, choosing instead to move along narrow lines of thorn trees, their feet brushing softly against dry leaves to mask the sound of their steps. Even celebrations changed. Weddings once filled with drums and laughter became subdued affairs, with music played low, voices softer, movement cautious. No one wanted to draw attention from above. At funerals, mourners glanced upward almost as often as they looked at the ground. Grief had always been heavy here, but now it carried a second weight, the fear that even sorrow might be observed by something that did not understand it. Night brought no relief. In the hours when darkness thickens and lamps flicker inside clay houses, the hum sometimes returned. Softer, smoother, a thin thread weaving through the quiet. People whispered about it behind half-open doors. Some said these watchers belonged to distant forces. Others believed they were the tools of nearby fighters. A few claimed they came from neither, that they were simply the newest shape of danger in a land already crowded with it. No one truly knew. Knowing was no longer the point. Enduring was. And beneath this uneasy ceiling, life learned to continue with smaller movements. Movements that revealed how deeply the sky had entered the lives of those below. A mother waking her child would first listen to the air before stepping outside with a bucket. A farmer would study the color of the horizon before deciding whether to walk the extra mile for water. A group of women gathering wood would scan the sky before bending down to pick up fallen branches. These gestures were small, but each carried the same silent question. Is the sky clear today? One evening, near the edge of a village built around a cluster of acacia trees, a boy asked his grandfather why the sky watched them so closely. The old man looked up for a long moment. The clouds drifted slowly, their shadows stretching like quiet creatures across the barren ground. "It is not the sky," he said softly. "It is what we have allowed to live inside it." The boy frowned. "So who will take it back?" The old man sighed, his gaze lingering where the last traces of daylight dimmed. "In the cities," he said, "leaders speak of reclaiming what hovers above us. They make promises with strong voices. Voices like that of Ibrahim Traore, saying the sky will one day belong to the people again." He paused, "But here, in the dust, we hear only the hum." The boy did not respond. He merely leaned closer as the hum faded and the night thickened around them. Across the Sahel, this feeling spread, a mixture of resilience and resignation, of walking forward while glancing upward, of carrying on with life under a ceiling that refused to stay still. And the villagers learned something else too. A sky that never sleeps can weigh more heavily than any danger on the ground. And so a quieter question took root beneath the restless air. If the sky has been claimed by unseen hands, where does freedom choose to walk now? Far from the desert roads, in rooms lit by pale screens, the Sahel appears small, a cluster of shifting colors, lines bending, dark patches moving like slow breaths across a map. To those watching from a distance, the hum of the sky is not a sound at all, it is a pattern. A flicker on satellite feeds, a moving dot that drifts across a digital landscape, familiar enough to study, distant enough to feel unreal. Analysts lean over their displays, tracing arcs of flight the way farmers once traced the paths of migrating birds. They zoom in, zoom out, switch filters, overlay shapes, trying to understand why these small machines prefer one valley to another, why they hover above some roads and ignore others, why the air here seems to carry secrets that the ground refuses to speak. Reports describe the region with calm phrases, phrases like emerging patterns and new forms of tension. They speak of the Sahel as if it were an experiment, a place where the sky is being rewritten by hands unseen, methodical, persistent. Sometimes, the observers point to a narrow stretch of land and say this corridor holds lessons for future conflicts. Sometimes they call it a threshold, sometimes a warning, but rarely a home. On their maps, villages become dots, roads become thin veins. A field becomes a pale rectangle marked by coordinates no one living there would ever recognize. And high above these shapes, small silhouettes glide, their shadows reduced to data, their presence measured in distance and angle. In one of these rooms, a finger taps on the screen, highlighting a zone where several drones have crossed paths in recent months. The note beside it reads, "Unusual density, likely to expand." A quiet voice replies, "That includes the area near Burkina Faso." The remark carries no weight in the room. It is just another line, one of many. But far away, on the actual ground beneath that digital mark, people tilt their heads to listen to the hum, wondering why the sky feels heavier on some days than others. The observers continue their work, never seeing the faces beneath the shadows they study. For them, the Sahel is a distant puzzle, a place where machines circle and patterns shift, where the sky itself seems to be testing new rules. But what the screens cannot show is the quiet pause before a villager steps into the open, the hesitation of a convoy choosing the shade over the road, the way the dust lifts at the exact moment a drone passes overhead, as if the desert breathes in response. The analysts talk about strategy, about trajectories and probabilities, about how this region teaches the world to watch the sky before watching the ground. But the Sahel does not need lessons. It already understands. It has lived long enough to know that every watcher creates another shadow, and every shadow carries its own kind of truth. And somewhere between those screens and this dust, a quiet thought lingers like a thin cloud. Technology may guide the sky, but it cannot decide what the land endures. Evening settles slowly in the Sahel. It does not fall, it drifts. A long sheet of violet dusk sliding over the sand, softening the edges of huts, quieting the footsteps of those heading home. But above the gentle descent, the sky prepares for something else. There are nights when the air feels thicker, as if holding its breath for what might arrive. A faint tremor, a pulse of movement, a distant flicker. Each one a reminder that the sky is no longer the empty shelter it once was. People have begun to change the way they move beneath it. A man guiding his donkey across a dry field keeps his eyes low, measuring the shadows instead of the stars. Women gathering wood speak in softer tones, their words wrapped tightly between moments of listening. Children are taught not just where to walk, but when to pause, when the silence feels wrong, when the air vibrates in that barely their way, that turns the hairs on a person's arm to small messengers. And yet, the sky continues to learn its own language. Some nights, a small machine drifts close to the tree line, circling gently, its light blinking with a slow, patient rhythm. Other nights, a different shape glides much higher, almost invisible, as if testing how far it can watch without being noticed. People speculate quietly. They say the sky is training, preparing, choosing new paths. Whatever the truth, the land reacts. Thorn bushes sway even when wind does not touch them. Goats grow restless beneath certain patches of sky. Dogs lift their heads, ears twitching, tracking something that only sound, not sight, can reveal. There is talk, too, of machines that can silence the hum, that send a ripple through the air so strong that the watchers above lose their balance and drift downward like confused birds. There is talk of others, machines that chase the hum, following it along invisible corridors that trace the shape of the night. Some say they look like dark insects, darting upward in quick lines, defending the space above families asleep in narrow rooms. No one knows how many are real, and how many belong to stories told around dim lamps. But the Sahel has always lived between certainty and rumor, between the known ground and the unknowable horizon, and now between the dust and the humming sky. One thing is clear to those who walk these roads: the future will not move quietly, not above them, not anymore. A boy carrying a bundle of firewood stops at the edge of a clearing one evening. He looks up, not in fear, but in a strange kind of acceptance, as though trying to memorize the shifting shapes that glide far above. "They will come more often," his mother whispers beside him, "more than the rain, more than the birds." He nods, the firewood creaking softly in his arms. The sky hums once, a thin line of sound stretching across the fading light. Then another hum answers it from somewhere deeper in the dusk. Two movements, two replies, two signals the land must learn to understand. And the quiet truth settles into the gathering night. Soon the sky may carry more footsteps than the ground. Night returns to the Sahel the way an old friend arrives, without knocking, without footsteps, simply appearing at the doorway of every village. The fields grow dark first, their cracked lines swallowed by shadow. Then the trees fade, their branches becoming thin silhouettes against the sky that has learned too many names and forgotten none. Above it all, the watchers drift, sometimes close, sometimes distant, their hum threading through the stillness like a reminder that the air now carries its own witness. Once, the sky belonged to stars. Now it belongs to memory. It remembers the boy staring upward, with firewood in his arms. It remembers the shepherd moving along the tree line, counting the heartbeats between each thin vibration. It remembers the hush that falls over markets, the way voices lower, the way footsteps slow, whenever a small shadow glides across the dust. And somewhere far from these villages, cities speak of promises. Promises that the sky will one day soften, that the hum will fade, that the ceiling above the Sahel will no longer press so heavily on the people below. Names drift through these promises, carried by distant radios, passing from one settlement to another. Some speak of Ibrahim Traoré as a voice trying to steady the trembling air above his homeland. Others whisper that leaders like him must one day reclaim not just the land, but the silence that once sheltered Burkina Faso from the watching eyes above. But in the villages, promises travel differently. They arrive slowly, moving with the same caution as a traveler crossing an open plain. And by the time they settle, the hum has already returned, soft, insistent, reminding everyone that the sky keeps its own counsel. Still, hope survives here, quietly, stubbornly. In the way a mother shields her child at dusk, in the way an old man lifts his face to the wind, as if listening for a moment when the air might finally rest. And if that day comes, if the sky lifts its weight and breathes again, some may remember the name Ibrahim Traoré as part of the long, uncertain journey that led to it. For now the Sahel waits, not in fear but in endurance. The dust settles, the night thickens, and the sky, full of stories it never asked to witness, keeps them all. If you wish to follow the path where the sky shapes the ground, stay with this series and let the night speak a little longer.